We are walking through the year 1989, moving on in the year 1989 to September 30, the famous speech by Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the balcony speech at the West German Embassy in Prague. You notice that on our schedule of the events in '89, there's one thing missing that one would expect first. This is the Berlin Fall of the Wall. Deliberately so, we decided to leave it out because this is the event that, after all these happenings, overshadowed all the other events. And since this institute, the IWM, for all the time of its work, has been very interested in the Central European region, we deliberately decided to skip this event and to leave it to the Germans themselves. And they do a lot of that in this year, 1989, as you might have noticed. But one thing we could not skip, and this is the famous speech by Hans-Dietrich Genscher, and I find it's also very interesting because it's crossing nationalities or crossing states at that time, because it also involves the Czechs, and this is why we have a perfect setup for this talk with the two of you, with Dagmar Rychnowska from the Institute für Höhere Studien here in Vienna, but of Czech origin. And your counterpart, a German counterpart to the Czech speaker, Ralf Beste, the German ambassador to Austria. And the floor is yours, please.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to talk about 1989 from the Czech perspective, or rather from the perspective of my generation in the Czech Republic. And thus shaping the memory of 1989 in this wider region. What I would like to do is to start with my very scarce memory and my family memory of 1989 and situate it in a broader context of the social atmosphere in Czechoslovakia back then. And then hopefully we will move to the topic of how these events are remembered in the Czech and German societies nowadays, and perhaps more importantly, or at least for me as a political scientist, more importantly, what are the implications of this memory politics? So I believe that one of my first personal memories come actually from November 1989. Because I was sitting on my dad's shoulders in the city center of Brno, the second largest city of nowadays Czech Republic. And there were quite a lot of people there. And I just remember this feeling of being in the square with these thousands and thousands of people, not really having idea what's going on. But as I later understood, this was one of the November days when demonstrations took place in many Czech cities, including Brno. And this eventually led to the end of the communist regime in Czechoslovakia. When I talked with my parents how they learned about the demonstration, because nowadays how people organize demonstrations, well, via social media, right? But there were no social media back then. So when I asked them how they learned about the demonstration, they told me, well, via radio, actually via Austrian radio, because that was the only source of this kind of information in Czechoslovakia then. When I asked, like, so didn't you talk about these things at work with your colleagues or with your friends? No, it was not possible, because this type of political activity was not really discussed even with close friends or close colleagues. So I think that's an interesting part that we sometimes forget, how technology really shaped the prospects of political action. Now, what kind of demonstration was that? It was actually very peaceful demonstration, and I remember my father telling me how there were policemen all over the square, but none of them actually dared to intervene, dared to use any kind of force. They were only pretending to do something because they were probably observed from distance by their supervisors, so that they have to pretend that they are actively holding the crowds in a peaceful way, but they did nothing. And I think this is very characteristic for the performance of good citizenship under communist regime in general, that you perform doing something while you don't really believe that this has any impact, or you don't really believe that this has any meaning. At the same time, there was still a lot of fear that the police would actually intervene, because people still remembered the violent intervention from the Warsaw Pact armies in 1968, which ended precisely these types of demonstrations. So from my family memory, there was very strong tension between the fear of violent action from the state authorities and possibly from the Warsaw Pact soldiers on the one hand, and on the other hand, there was also the notion that something is in the air that is different from '68. And this something is in the air was to a great extent shaped also what happened in Prague almost 2 months before these November demonstrations. And that was, of course, the situation of German refugees or refugees from the German Democratic Republic who came to Prague to ask for asylum at the embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany. And after 2 months of camping and protesting at the embassy, they were finally allowed to go via Prague to West Germany. So I would like to now ask you, what are your memories of 1989 and this specific event?
Yeah, thanks very much. I think we're a very well-suited couple as eyewitnesses, because you were too young and I was too remote to the events at that time. Because I was a 23-year-old student of history at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore at that time, and I was as detached from the sequence of events as you can be, and large part of that was due to media. I remember that we were speaking about an event in late September, where things were really turning wild and sometimes violent in Europe, and I was as detached that I remember a situation in the Library of Congress in Washington, in the cafeteria. I was there with a friend, and there was a researcher, an American one, who approached us, very clear-sighted in hindsight, saying, so when is this wall going to come down, and when do we see reunification? And we explained to him with all our academic political theory background and whatever, so this is a non-starter. That's not going to happen. The regime is stabilizing with the exchange of the Politburo, and I went to great lengths to tell him that he could forget about it, and a month later the wall came down. So I'm really an expert on that. Ever since and I could go on further how detached I was, because I mean the media was very crucial in that regard. I was looking American cable network news, which was largely about how we won the Cold War and less about what was really happening on the ground, and relying on East Germans who happened to be able to speak English, which weren't that many. So it was quite obvious that the sources weren't exactly good. At the same time, getting hold of a German newspaper in America at that time was quite difficult. So I remember reading in the library of my university 2-week-old editions, copies of the Süddeutsche Zeitung. That was so. Letters from my friends were more instructive than anything like media. So there was no internet, no social media, nothing. So ever since I've been trying to reconstruct that, because as the irony continues, I came back to Germany on the 5th of October 1990 when it was already reunified. So I had a strange feeling that the country had been changing while I was away. So I put quite some effort into trying to reconstruct that, and maybe just to bring you up to the details that Dagmar just alluded to. It was, I mean, the September 30th moment, the speech of Hans-Dietrich Genscher was, I think, as significant as it can be, because it showed how essentially it wasn't only the intellectuals and the ideas that decided that, but just people who wanted to improve their life and their fate, and who took their fate into their own hand and just went to countries that were more open, where they had more chances than on the direct route, from east to west Germany, which was still proving to be lethal in '89. There were shootings at the wall, and we had a victim, Chris Geffroy, who died, I think, in May 1989, trying to make the direct way. So they went through Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and they did so in droves. There were, I think, about 3,000 people inside the embassy compound in Prague. And at the same time, the foreign minister, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, was almost as detached from events as I was, because in late September, traditionally, it's the opening of the General Assembly of the United Nations, and he was in New York. So the negotiations about what to do about these people happened in New York within the delegation and with the delegation of the GDR. And there they decided essentially about the options that they were having, and the West German delegation put a lot of pressure on the East German one. And essentially, Genscher said, you have to help us get those out of the compound. The sanitation is terrible, people are going to be sick, and this is all going to be this is all going to count on your reputation, and if people get sick, people die or whatever, or further escalations might happen. And the GDR was actually quite sane and responsible in that regard. So Genscher made essentially, but they insisted that they had to go through the GDR or not. And Genscher offered two options, and he said, okay, we have two ways of pretending that the GDR still has a say, and that one is you have GDR civil servants going into the embassy and putting rubber stamping the passports, and then they go, or we symbolically take the trains not directly into Bavaria or Germany, but rather go through GDR territory. And they needed time to think about it. Genscher took his plane back and flew to Bonn, where they met the East German government representatives that had been thinking about it. And then that's a small thing that shows us how complex diplomacy was in those times. Symbolically, Genscher insisted that they meet in the Chancellery and not in the Foreign Ministry, because intra-German affairs were not considered a foreign affair. So legally, the Auswärtiges Amt was not in charge, although it was the foreign minister who was negotiating. So they met in the Chancellery, and the East German officials said, okay, we do the way through the GDR with the train, and off we go. And so he flew to Prague and went there and onto the balcony, and this famous speech was about like 11 words, and he couldn't end it because the masses erupted in cheers because they felt they knew the gist of it now, that they were allowed to leave the country. So it didn't have to be complete in even this one single sentence. And it was true, but then the real problem happened, because when he told the people that they would have to take a train that goes through the GDR, everybody was losing faith instantly, and they were coming desperately in a minute. So that was the moment when Genscher had to muster the courage, or seize the moment and try to instill some sort of confidence into those people, who like went up and down in 1 minute in their expectations. And what he did was just fabulous, a very small gesture. He was originally from central Germany, from Halle, and what he did, he said, are there any people from Halle, from my hometown here? People raised their hands and so on, and he addressed them, trust me, I'm on your side. I'm essentially one of you. and then he said essentially the same thing again, and said, we're going to trust my word, and essentially he trusted the GDR's word, which maybe also shows how far Ostpolitik went, that people trusted each other even in a situation like that, and rightly so. So not only did the federal ministers who were there was one other, the Chancellery minister, go onto the trains as hostages, so to say, or as pawns, but also the other diplomats who were on board. They were all on board of the train to ensure that if the GDR would stop the trains, it would be German diplomats and ministers who would be held hostage as well. And what completely went wrong for the GDR authorities at that time was that the trains were not like, they turned out to be a symbol of freedom, because they were greeted with cheers along the tracks through the GDR. They were greeted as the happy ones who were able to leave. So that was maybe essentially the sign, the moment where everybody except me and Washington, respectively Baltimore, understood that the days of this regime were counted.
Yeah, I think the interesting the interesting side that we both kind of hinted on is the absence of Moscow in this story, this surprising absence of Moscow. Because not such a long time ago, the Brezhnev doctrine was in power, and the constant fear that Moscow would intervene in one way or another into these events was still in people's minds. So I think this is what also contributed to this uncertainty and perhaps even mistrust among people, what will happen, even though things look quite good and smooth, it can still go wrong in a second.
I mean, that's the Czech experience with '68.
Exactly.
You have the spring, and then you have Russian tanks coming in from the GDR and quelling the revolution, so to say.
Exactly.
So, and that was probably one of the things that was on everybody's minds, that things could go south any minute. Genscher did have conversations with his Russian counterparts in New York for that reason. And the good relations, the rapport with Gorbachev and so on was of course very important in that moment. But that is obviously the one thing that was really different to former times, that the Russians or the Soviets at that time didn't really insist on their leverage and their tutelage. That's right.
How are these events nowadays remembered in Germany? And are there perhaps differences between the former Democratic Republic and the Federal Republic?
I think generally speaking, it's still, and that's what's happening these days in Germany, is being commemorated as a liberation, and a marvelous story, almost a fairy tale of a unification that nobody had really been expecting anymore. That's one side of it. So very positive, and it's a unique gift. We achieved unification peacefully and installed liberty in the whole country. At the same time, there is a surprisingly high level of discontent. Maybe it has to do, and that comes back to historical questions of historical distance, that one generation later, many people reconsider, and surprisingly many do. There was a poll by Allensbach Institute in the FAZ recently that asked East Germans how they felt about it, and the number that is still on my mind was, roughly speaking, that 40% of those asked felt that when it comes to the rule of law, the GDR wasn't that much of a problem. So in hindsight, very many people obviously think it wasn't as bad as they might have thought then, which may give us clues as to how the progress that has been made over the last 30 years may be evaluated in different ways now, when you don't see the pain of being not in liberty, and still feel that there are other problems that are as difficult as ever. So the sort of romantic look back to a East German society where people were less egoistic, where job security was provided and everybody was among friends, communities worked. That's getting stronger as people grow older, but the downsides recede in memory. That is not a universal trend, but it's a surprisingly strong one, and in my recollection, the discussion about what unification was about and what was achieved was as strong as in the 90s now, maybe never before. How's it in your country?
There are striking similarities, I would say, because the winning narrative, the hegemonic narrative, is that of liberation and being grateful for this liberation. So there is, for instance, since 5 years, it started in like 5-6 years ago, there is this initiative that on the commemoration of 17 November 1989, there is a big street party / peaceful demonstration in the center of Prague at Národní třída, so the street where the main demonstration took place back then. And the motto of the party is "Thank you that we can." Děkujeme, že můžem. And it basically expresses this gratitude for the world of opportunities that has been opened especially to my generation. And of course, we are very grateful, and I am very grateful. I do realize that I'm speaking from a very privileged position. But at the same time, I think there is something missing in this narrative of what happened and what were the implications thereof. Because what is only being stressed in the media and the political discourse is what went great and all the freedoms that democracy brought to the Czech society, with a huge focus, for instance, on the interstate mobility. So the symbol of the border as the communist evil, the closed border as the communist evil, versus the open borders nowadays highlighted with the Schengen area. This is the symbol of democracy. And these are, of course, important, highly important things for obvious reasons and absolutely understandable reasons. But democracy is not just open borders, right? Democracy also has profound impact on what's going on in the very country, in the very society, how institutions work, how rule of law work. And these are things which are sometimes forgotten, especially the not so successful stories. So while there's a lot of commemoration of what went great and what we are grateful for, there is very little memory of what we are not so grateful for since 1989. Which then would open space for the people which you mentioned that didn't so much profit from the turn to democracy, and which nowadays don't really have any representatives in the public discourse, or very few, who would symbolize their story. The story is always about the hero, about the dissidents like Václav Havel, about people who became later successful political or economic elites who were shaping the events of 89. But many people feel frustrated that their ordinary story, in which they profited to great extent from the job stability and so forth under communism, that this kind of story is not really represented, and they now feel dissatisfied with the contemporary situation.
Well, that may be true, because especially as you mentioned, we are in the topic of historical narratives. The question is, who's writing the story? Yeah. And in Germany, it was, of course, the dissidents, the civil rights movement, and the intellectual resistance that was telling the story. It was a good story. It's a brilliant story. And that's one of the reasons why I emphasized the average man in the street who brought about the change. It were the masses who moved, and not the intellectuals who wrote, that finally brought the system down. But their story isn't as much told. We have this very strange situation that even the story of the liberation of the demonstrations that were taking place in East Germany, in Leipzig and wherever, are being hijacked by the right-wing party AfD, which is essentially manned as very many political institutions in East Germany in the leadership by West Germans, who say we want to, who are claiming that they want their history back, which essentially wasn't theirs either. But that's part of the irony. But it's very much about the question: who's telling the story? Whose story is it? What is it really about? And the issues of liberty and security, prosperity are all intermingled, and everybody picks the one that he really likes. And values have been changing due to changes of perspectives. When you're locked in a system and cannot travel, open borders are very tempting and something you fight for. When you're in a country and people come into your country and you feel threatened by them, open borders is a threat and not a promise. So the reconsideration of open borders due to the migration crisis probably had its share in the reevaluation of the benefits of the demise of the Eastern system, and the European Union was something which was not in the cards in 1990, but this changed, profoundly changed all our countries. But of course, it is partly being attributed, the change that was being brought about by the European Union, and especially the downsides of it, are definitely also being attributed to the whole system that one fought to get and finally got.
Exactly, exactly. So what I'm really wondering is how to do this better. How can
Next time.
how can we do the memory politics in a society better, so that we do not arrive just at very one-sided narratives of what happened by the winners, and we are able to include more voices and more experiences, and while celebrating the revolution, which is certainly great and beneficial for the society, but also while celebrating this, being able to be critical to the evolution that happened afterwards. And I'm wondering if you might have some lessons learned from the German society on how to discuss history in a fruitful way, so that it can lead to this critical distance, but at the same time not really misplacing the basic values that we stand for as democratic societies.
I mean, that's a very fundamental issue of writing history. One thing is it's mostly the winners who write the history. I mean, that was very famous by Winston Churchill when he said, "I know how history will judge me because I intend to write it." So it's usually being framed by the winners. That's one thing. Second is, I mean, I saw Philipp Ther, who is a historian. He's over there. I mean, he can chip in later when his turn is there. But the question is, you need a certain distance. History is being essentially, it's a negotiation process of those who write it and those who tell it. And there is no one official history. So it's crucially about those people who write that history. And if the losers don't write the history, it won't be written. The others won't do it for them. And maybe the discussions that we were having in Germany over like who owns the revolution of '89, that is a contribution to this writing of history. And maybe in 10 years' time we'll have a new appraisal. As we're having new appraisals of history, last year I read one of the 30 Years' War, and I read one about Metternich and whatever. You're having reappraisals of history all the time. That's what history is about. It's always being written from the perspective of the contemporary researchers and the societies who look back on history in order to try to orientate themselves. And maybe that is a second phase that is being started. I think you cannot decree that or do it better next time, because you will always have these moments where the winners write it and then there might be a reconsideration. That's probably happening in all those countries right now. And maybe that is an issue that comes up after 30 years or whatever, that a newer generation that, like you, hasn't really experienced it personally, and which is totally unburdened by own prejudices and whatever. As I said, I was a child of West integration. I have a very clear compass in that direction. But maybe others who are 10 or 20 years younger will have a fresher look at that, and that doesn't have to be wronger, not better either.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I believe that this is a huge challenge for probably my generation to be able to look at those events from with a fresh eye and assess what went well and what didn't go so well. At the same time, my generation is also very much stuck with the winning narratives. We are all children of our parents. We are all in a certain social bubble, as we like to say nowadays. And what I experience in the Czech Republic is really this prevalence of the winning discourse. Thank you that we can. Thank you for the opportunities that this has brought to us. And as I said, I believe that this is absolutely great, but at the same time, in order to write the future, we have to be able to assess in a more complex way what the last 30 years have brought to us, and how can we tackle the challenges that appeared with the post-communist post-democratic transformation, so that we are really able to write the future in a better way and in a productive way, especially since we are part of the common European family.
Well, I think a contribution that historians or social scientists might bring, or journalists might bring to the that situation, is to rather focus on the other side, which is generally a good recommendation to every journalist, but also historians. I mean, what I told you, the story at the start, was of course to 95% based on West German sources, West German diplomats up to Hans-Dietrich Genscher. It would be interesting to read it from East German diplomats' recollections, how they saw that, how maybe some facts, but also the impressions were completely different. And we always learn about those people who left East Germany and got lucky in the West, or not lucky and returned, but there's hardly any story about those who decided not to move. And just to say why they did that. That is not a hero story, and there's not much action, but it might be very helpful to understand the whole picture of it. I was just a very far away, but just to remember that. Maybe most of you who had Latin in class or studied ancient history know Cicero's famous speeches about the Coniurazione Catiline, about the conspiration of Catilina. That is very convincing pleading in court, but it is our only source to understand the machinations of Catilina. Nobody asked poor Catilina if it was just nailed to the cross by this rhetoric monster Cicero, who invented a conspiration and got away with it for 2,000 years, and everybody believes it verbatim. So ask Catilina. As long as he's not dead.
Very good, very good.
But what does it teach that for things that might happen? Yeah, as I would generally say, ask the other side. Ask the other side, even if it's boring and it's not sexy to talk to the losers.
Maybe I can add a word on that. Sorry for intervening. You obviously have the last word. I just wanted to say we started this week of 89 Recollections and Reflections with 2 literature readings, and there's this one very nice sentence by a Bosnian author, Dževad Karahasan, that got stuck in my mind. He said on Monday night, he said, history is written by the winners. This is what you were discussing. Literature is written by those who suffered from history. So, Dagmar, when you raised the question what to do and how to improve, how to do it better than the second time, maybe read more literature. That would be one answer to that. And I just wanted to add, because you said, Mr. Ambassador, it's so great to have you on this for this diplomatic masterpiece. You said you were very far away. I was in West Berlin at that time. And I remember it very, very differently, and I think to very many of us, also my friends around, this was a message of there's something dramatically changing, because a state that cannot get hold of the people there, it was an indicator of GDR losing control of the situation. I mean, these 2,000 or 3,000 people in the embassy, also the Hungarian refugees. So it was a dramatic event, and I just wanted to add, and I find this so like touching and breathtaking. Hans-Dietrich Genscher, when giving this speech, was very, very sick. He just flew back from the US, as you nicely described, and he arrived there, and he was in such a bad condition that there was actually people behind him. I think maybe it was Rudolf Seiters, I don't know.
He had 2 surgeons with him.
And one of them actually held him. He really grabbed him because they were afraid that he would fall down from the balcony. This is just a little recollection. I think that is also. I mean, it was really a wonderful diplomatic masterpiece, and I think it's the dream of every diplomat or politician to once in lifetime experience such a situation.
Actually, the diplomats that I've been talking to about who were young at that time, they still start to glow when they talk about it, because they were standing in those trains and they were like preparing the negotiations. But that's, again, the winner's story. We discussed about that briefly before. I totally like the layout of your discussion, but in order to understand how little discontent there is in Germany with the sequence of events and what came out of that, just turn on the evening news and look what is happening in Chile these days. In Chile, it was September, the same month, 89, where the brave Chileans ousted the 16-year dictatorship of Pinochet. Now, 30 years later, and that's part of it, there is a reconsideration. What did it bring us? What have we won from democracy? And as you see in the street protests, the balance is pretty dull and gloomy, and they turn to violence. And compared with that, I don't want to appear cynical in that respect, but things have turned out pretty well, and the way that we're dealing with it is very civilized. Our party system is under stress, and we have these divergences and so on, but by and large, I think the recollections are quite positive.
Maybe just to add to that, because when I did some research on the Czech memory of the events at the German embassy, I realized that there is actually very little said about this event. Mostly what stuck in people's minds is how Prague got flooded by East German Trabis, so the leftovers, so to speak, of the refugee crisis. But the main thing that happened at the soil of the embassy is not so much commemorated. People don't really know much about that. And it's so interesting that in this globalized world and very much interconnected back then as well, there can be such distance between what is happening at one space and people not knowing about the relevance of these events.
Which is interesting, because for us Germans, it would naturally it would be only natural that for the Czechs, the embassy is a historical site, but it's less so for you than for us.
Yeah, surprisingly. Yeah. So I think this only highlights the importance of collective memorizing, collective storytelling, such as we do here today. The cross-cultural commemoration of what happened in each country, and by that I think we are able to realize that there are many commonalities and maybe also many common problems.
But that reminds me of a friend of mine who told me that he's been telling his daughter, he's East German, from East Berlin, and he said that he's been telling his young daughter that the Leipzig demonstrations are one thing, but there wouldn't have been Leipzig demonstrations if there hadn't been the Lenin shipyards and the demonstrations in Poland, which were the starting point of it. So everything comes from there, and I think we as Germans, most of us are aware, like I described, but could be more aware of that, how much we owe to the Central Europeans, which does not mean that we do not understand how much we owe to the Americans in the moment when it was about guaranteeing the security of that process, but and the determination in bringing this about. But of course it was the people in the Central European countries that lighted the flame that we essentially carried home.
Exactly. So even though we commemorate individual countries' events, there's always larger international political context which played a role, and I think it's really great to highlight this one.
I think we're running out of time now. I'm getting signals all the time.
Okay. Yeah, I think we have already come to the end.
Yeah, okay.
Unfortunately, we could continue for another hour, no problem. Just one little, because it so nicely fits with Dagmar's remark about the Trabis and the Wartburgs left behind in Prague. Yesterday we had the literature reading by Noemi Kish from Hungary, and this is exactly what she described in her novel, like all the left behind Wartburgs and Trabis at the Austrian-Hungarian border when the East German refugees had gone over to the other side.
What happened to them?
They just remained there for years.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is the impressive leftovers or left behinds of the refugees, and it was a wonderful literary depiction of it that she gave yesterday. So it just reminded me of that. And I think to come to an end with this, I think you were a wonderful Czech-German tandem on this, and I both thank you so very much for this. It was very great to have you for this. Thank you.
Thank you.